Good morning. Good morning, YouTube. Good morning, Facebook. Good morning, anybody who watches this video. Please comment. Please subscribe. If your comment is, you're an idiot, that's great. Whatever it is, I'm cool. Bring it on. If you tell me I'm an idiot, please tell me why I'm an idiot. I think that's fair. I'm going to start this off with a quote, and I quote directly from Bret Hart's Hall of Fame speech. He says, for everybody around the world, all the wrestlers, everybody around the world, I want you to know that the best chance you have if you want to rise to the top is to give yourself over to loneliness, fear nothing, and work hard. One thing you'll discover is that life is less than you thought about what you learned, and much more than you thought about what you had inside of you right from the beginning. And that was probably what the catalyst that turned me into a big Bret Hart fan. He made a movie, Paul J, from the realnewsnetwork.com. I believe that's it. Apologize, Mr. J. I think he produced that movie. He's a big progressive. Some would say liberal, some would say socialist. Any pejorative terms, Mr. J is all those things. I think he'd be proud of them. And from what I can see, Bret is also. I remember Bret talking about in Canada how they cared for each other and they weren't a bunch of trash, and they would never have a movement like our movement where people that were barely making would hate people who weren't making it at all, like we see in our politics. We see poor people being blamed for the housing crisis, poor people being hated, poor people barely being mentioned in debates when we've had a proliferation of poor people, so forth, so on. Well, enough of that. Let's talk to the principles here. This is about the Montreal Screw Job, as you can tell by the title. The Montreal Screw Job, in plain English, was probably the greatest work in the history of wrestling. By work, I mean they fooled everybody. It was actually not what it appeared. And if you ask Vince or Bret, I don't think you're going to get a straight answer from either one of them what happened. I just don't believe that anybody would hit Mr. McMahon unless he wanted them to. I don't believe anybody messes with that guy. I wouldn't. If he hit me, I would not hit him back. No question about it. I would just take it and walk away. That's what I would do. Because he is a bad, bad dude. No question about it. So anyway, here's what happened. They had set it up where they had made the Paul J movie. I forgot the name of it. It was made in Canada. It was a wonderful movie. It showed Bret with his first wife. It showed Bret running around with his son in the car. It talked about his character, how he felt about his character, how he felt about wrestling, why he liked wrestling, why he liked doing it. Talked about his father. There was a very dramatic part where his father was wrestling this little kid and he was stretching him out. Well, he's actually a big kid, about a 280-pound kid, and he was just twisting him, and he'd say, "Discipline, discipline," and the guy was just screaming in pain. He was a shooter. His dad was a shooter, and I'm sure Bret is a shooter. You know, Bret could put you in a hole that hurts you bad. No question about it. So they got into the Hart family, the Hart Foundation, his history of wrestling, where he came from, all those things in that film. And they alluded to them. I don't know if they showed them all. So anyway, Bret had talked about the character, and then he went to, and I think this was prior to the incident, the Montreal Screw Job. Now, the other person involved in the ring was a guy, Shawn Michaels. Now Shawn started out, he very similar history to Bret. He was called by the WWE's recent thing, 50 Greatest, he was called the greatest wrestler of all time, and I don't have any problem with it. The guy is phenomenal. He overcame good looks to make it in wrestling. The guy was too good looking to be a great wrestler. I mean, he was just, because wrestling is a male sport. So males go to see it, so they're going to naturally have a fit, not like this guy because he's so good looking. There's a part of a male that's jealous of other males because they're so good looking, they're going to get all the chicks. So they don't like him. They may not be true, but it does. But he's a very tough guy. You know, he could work for an hour. He had a great tag team. He was just a great guy. And a lot of guys like me, for all the things I just outlined, didn't like the guy. So even when he was popular and he was getting a big push, I wasn't crazy about him. But he's another one of the... I don't have a problem saying he's the greatest wrestler of all time. No problem with it at all. No problem with any of that. I would say Ric Flair was the greatest wrestler of all time. And I'm not going to define what a great wrestler is. We'll leave that for another video. So let's get back to the Montreal. So we have this guy, these two guys that have an affinity for each other, or it appears that way. One's like a working man, the other one's like royalty, one's like a heel, one's like a good guy, and they kind of blur those lines, and they went back and forth. They had this great thing where they were going the Canadian thing where they hated him. So, and to be frank, I don't even remember if the Canadian thing came after or before the screw job. I don't know. I can't remember. So, long story short, they get into the ring. They're going to have a match. They'd had a match prior that lasted an hour. So they had been building this up for quite some time. So all of a sudden they start wrestling. And I don't mean anything negative about that term, wrestling. But they start wrestling. And Shawn tries to put Bret in his own move. You know, this it's kind of a scorpion deathlock. I forgot the name that he called it. But he was putting him in his move. You know, where he rolls him over. I learned to do it to my kids, and I didn't really hurt them, but it hurts. You know, he said that a wrestler named Conan had taught to him. I don't remember if that's the facts, but he was putting him in his finisher. All right, and I can't remember. So Shawn was using Bret's finisher. And if somebody can put it in the comments below what the finisher was, I would appreciate it. And you can put it down there. Hey, it's this, you idiot. That's fine. I have no problem with that. Call me an idiot. If I don't get an idiot, this was an unsuccessful video. I want to make that clear here at 712. So he puts him in his own move, and Hebner, who's maybe the greatest referee of all time, calls him out. So they're in Montreal, Bret's hometown, or close to Bret's home country. And this guy, who some people have references to him being, you know, a guy that, not a guy that we would like. I'm not going to say the words, but there's rumors about him and another principal here. I'm not going to say that, but he's rumored. I don't believe any of it, but that's fine. He's got all this put on him, and he beats him. And afterwards, Bret just blows up. In the locker room, the wife yells at Triple H. The wife yells at all of them, and they just act like they don't know what's going on. And Bret spits on Mr. McMahon, and Bret's one of these guys, these macho type guys that can spit. I mean, he could spit and get a big loogie. He puts a loogie on the guy. And then they go in the locker room. Nobody witnesses, but McMahon comes out here with a bruise on his face. And they go back, and McMahon does this thing where he says Bret Hart screws Bret Hart. The big giant wrestler says Bret Hart deserved it. I mean, there's been comments by almost, you could put the Montreal Screw Job in there, and you get all kinds of comments. It was even referred to in TNA a couple of years back where they did a thing on it. And I bought into it. It's just like, to this day, some people think that the Andy Kaufman Jerry Lawler thing was staged, and in the movie Man on the Moon, they kind of admitted that it was a whole work. It was a work. So, I mean, some of these works are so good, they work people. They don't know, you know. And it was brilliant. So, let's get to the meat of the issue. I had listened on it, and I had not been convinced that it was a work until I heard George the Animal Steele break it down. George the Animal Steele, who played Tor Johnson in Ed Wood, who Tor Johnson was an iconic wrestler because he had that face. They had a face mask, and when I was a little kid, they had a face mask of him, and people knew it. People didn't know who Tor Johnson was, but this was a monster. We didn't even know it was a wrestler, but we knew the face. So along comes this guy, George Steele, in the as he calls it, the cartoon stage, because he was a wrestler before that, a real wrestler. He breaks it down, and this guy, George the Animal Steele, is smart. I mean, he was a school teacher. He's now become born again. He's a Christian. He overcame Crohn's disease. I mean, he's a really substantial, smart guy. He's a good man. You know, they asked him if he wrestled, and he said, well, at 75, I wrestle out of bed, which was a fun joke. It was getting out of bed was hard as wrestling was the implication. And he pretty much broke it down so well in his shoot interview, saying the things like, you know, Brett wouldn't have been upset because, you know, he won the belt in the United States. It wasn't his belt. It was Mr. McMahon's belt. He had no right to take the belt. So I don't think that Brett would have had any trouble doing the honor, giving up the belt. I don't think Brett would have bothered him at all. I think all that was a put on. I don't think Brett would do that. I don't think he would feel that way. I think Brett knows the business. And I can't believe that Brett would do that to Mr. McMahon. I cannot believe that that relationship is like that in any way. Period. Now, the other thing that George the Animal Steele said, and I agree with it, and I didn't even really realize it, after that, the McMahon character became the greatest heel in the history of wrestling. I mean, he did the thing with Stone Cold, and they'll trot him out when the ratings come out because people just can't stand the guy. He has this cocky walk that he does. He had this thing where he brought in Trump, and Trump would go, you're fired, and they were fired, and they brought in managers, they brought in all these big movie stars in here. So, I mean, it just looks that way to me. It looks like they fooled us and it was a work. I mean, if it wasn't a work, if it was just a coincidence, then somebody really figured it out pretty quick afterwards. Really doesn't matter. I mean, it was great. And I think they are both great professionals. I would say this about Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Vince McMahon, George the Animal Steele, Ric Flair, all those guys. If you told me anything about them being historically or greatest of all time, I would have no trouble with any of them saying that. None of them. Maybe George Steele, I don't know, because I just think he was playing around. He never even took it that seriously. He was just there for the money, is the way he put it. But it's good by me. So I think it was a work. If it wasn't a work, good job, Mr. McMahon, Mr. Hart, convincing us and selling it so well, or just getting that much heat, just natural. It's all good, brother. Out.